David's having trouble getting on.
Yeah, I'm
guess.
focused on this just right.
Okay, so no advice, no general advice.
Yeah, he was trying to help me, so he knows how I think. He knows how I work. After I really knew all about before I came here, and he was sitting there.
Hello, Kim.
Wait a minute, you're the person I knew. I'm trying to get on this one.
So Derek is the person who
No, he tried.
Do without.
So will you be opening?
What's that?
So will you be doing an opening?
Yeah, I'll do a little opening. You want me to use this?
Yep.
Okay.
It's hot right now. Okay, sorry.
California, Washington State. Because there's people who just think, well, who cares? You know, all these stairs. I know, right? Still did. Yeah, I agree. You don't want to, but still, it's like.
used to be a bar in DC.
It just goes to show you.
Maybe like a special cocktail, you know.
And the wife is
Usually the bar is always maybe just doing cocktail special. Like, we can have food hour.
you know,
Okay, good morning. Let's get started. It's 9 a.m. Good morning, everyone. Hello, Phil. And welcome. Well, hello, Vanessa. How nice to see you. So welcome to, I guess this is a CSPO Conversation, which is to be distinguished from a CSPO Policy Tools Breakfast in a manner that I am not competent to explain. What's important is that we convene from a broad community of people interested in science, technology, policy, politics, and society to hear the latest ideas about what's going on and then to have good conversations about them afterwards. And this morning, we're really fortunate to have David Demortain with us, who's going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is how we actually make connections between what we think we know and then what we decide to do in the regulatory realm, which is often reduced to a trope evidence-based policy, which is entirely unhelpful. And in fact, maybe it's worse, maybe it's even mischievous because it makes it sound like something simple where actually it's something incredibly complicated. So David comes to us from Paris, although we just spent a month, I guess, in Arizona, getting some sun to gird his loins for the coming long winter in Europe. And he works at a really interesting aggregation of scholars. Is it a new institute?
It's 4 years old.
Okay,
Yeah.
that at the intersection
Relatively
of science, technology, innovation, and policy. and it's part of a coalition of institutions, right? I guess the main one is INRA, which is the Agricultural Research Institute in Paris, but two others as well. I'm going to turn it over to him, but before doing so, just want to reinforce the rules here for those of you who haven't been here before, which is, again, this is about hearing some ideas, but then having conversation and building our community. So David will talk for about a half an hour. We'll open it up then for half an hour of moderated conversation. And then after that, we encourage you all to hang around, talk to one another, trade business cards, network, talk to David, who can hang with us for a while, and then come back for the next event. So let me turn it over to you, David.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everybody. So, yeah, delighted to be here and have the occasion to have this conversation about this, so science, EPA, and environmental politics, I guess. So I'm going to talk about the result of quite a few years of research. Well, obviously, perhaps some of you know more about the EPA and risk decision making than have been able to learn over these years, hence the interest in having a conversation with you. But at least I will try and so develop an argument here about how science is used and forged by the EPA in the very process of trying to regulate the environment. So, and yeah, in the interest of time, I'll try to keep that to half an hour, as Dan said. So, well, to jump in the topic right away, the book and the whole talk I'm going to give today is not really about the current news or the so-called war on science. I haven't chronicled all of that in the book, but still, it's the current context is sort of interesting, and it's one on which I hope that the history of EPA can teach us a few things. So, what we have nowadays, and again, it's a repetition of past episodes, but you have a moment when the current administration and the current team at the head of EPA, current leadership, intervenes quite strongly in the science, quite vigorously, trying to indeed shape the science on which it relies to develop standards. So again, I don't want to go through the many examples of this. It would take me too long, but you've got sort of press clips here from various kind of news outlets that through which we learned that the Scott Pruitt, for instance, reversed an expected decision to ban pesticides, choosing a different model for calculating the risks of pesticide. You have the administration disbanded a whole scientific committee, which sort of now is meeting outside the EPA, trying to continue the work. Recently, it sort of decided to apply a rule whereby unpublished studies cannot be used in the development of standards, de facto excluding a large set of epidemiological studies from consideration. And perhaps the last example of these kind of interventions, active interventions in the science, is this decision to actually ban by 2035, if I'm not wrong, all animal studies, making a choice between the kind of studies, an active choice among the kind of studies that can be used in regulatory development. So I think the idea here for people that lead the EPA currently is to try and go upstream in the regulatory process, shaping the science, the sort of scientific input, so that the science doesn't justify, I guess, too strong environmental standards and too strong environmental interventions. When that administration sort of came in 2-3 years ago. The headlines were, this is a war on science. But the point I want to make today is that it's not a war on science, borrowing a nice phrase from my colleague Clark Miller from ASU. But it's more of a war against science-informed government, against the kind of governmental work that is legitimized and supported by science. And because you have an administration here that wants to contain or roll back environmental intervention, logically it works through the science to sort of undermine environmental work. So the main point, the main thing we can learn from the history of the history I've made of the EPA is this one, is that science has legitimized the EPA and the adoption of contentious environmental standards. It has helped a certain kind of science, has helped the EPA making difficult decisions, advancing difficult environmental standards in a field of constant kind of dispute about the environment and what we want to do towards the environment. So, and there's a phrase that I like to quote that I think summarizes it all from Bill Riley, who was the administrator during at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, and he has this phrase, 4 out of 5 regulations signed by the EPA, by the EPA administrator, are contested in court. And that is just, a short sentence to illustrate that the EPA evolves in a field of contending forces. Every time it tries to make a decision, it has to factor in the potential opposition or disagreement of the industry it regulates, NGOs, public interest groups, the communities that are impacted, the administration itself, and so on, Congress, and so on and so forth. And my point again is here that risk decision making, which I call this science of bureaucracy, is the science that has been evolved at the EPA by people inside and outside the EPA to actually regulate in this field of contention, of dispute. Okay, so and I guess that's something we can again learn from to understand what's happening nowadays. So I guess what I'll do in the remaining time is walk you through some of these historical moments when risk decision making took form in its diversity, because it's a kind of heterogeneous kind of set of techniques. Okay, so I will highlight some of these, how they came about, in what kind of political atmosphere they were forged, and how they became helpful for the EPA to assert its legitimacy to make decisions or advance our environmental standards. So the first one, and so I'm going to take you back to the 1970s to understand how quantitative risk assessment came about. So quantitative risk assessment is this notion that to make the right sort of environmental standards, you need to calculate risk first. And then based on that risk calculation, you need to, based on those probabilities, then you need to adjust your decision and so shape the environmental standard in question. So to understand how that came about, we need to go back to the 70s and these moments of some say public scare around chemicals, or at least those moments of controversy when the public was apparently wanted chemicals to be regulated, possibly banned, because we were discovering their toxic potential. The EPA had to address those issues by law. It got responsibilities for pesticides, for instance, in the early 70s, and then chemicals found in water or in air. So in the 1970s, when the EPA started looking into this, it considered, and the EPA administrator considered it needed to act kind of boldly and try to ban some of these chemicals, and developed a sort of a quite aggressive legal strategy of asserting before the courts some strong facts about the toxicity of chemicals. And this did not quite work out because those facts were very controversial, were contested by either the industry or NGO groups who thought that these facts were sort of minimized, sort of the toxicity was minimized, but also by some scientists who believed that, well, did not go along with the EPA and its understanding of toxicity, and so on and so forth. The result being that the EPA did not manage to impose those bans in court. And so at that very moment, what happened is inside the EPA, with support from medical scientists and biologists working outside the EPA, the agency came up with a completely different idea of the right way to make decisions on these questions. So instead of doing a litigation strategy before the court advancing facts, it sort of designed a mechanism by which it would actually develop, rather than strong facts with a black and white picture of what's toxic, what's not toxic, a sort of mechanism by which it would elaborate levels of risk and organizationally make itself sort of capable of adjusting decisions to these levels of risk. So that's quantitative risk assessment. And the interesting fact is that there's a coalition of people who have put their sort of brains together to actually come up with this. It seems quite simple and obvious to us nowadays and logical, but in fact, I mean, it took a bit of brain power and experience to develop this with toxicologists, biostatisticians, and importantly, also policy analysts, people who were sort of mindful of the political circumstances, the political opportunity to make decisions, and who said, okay, this is the right way to develop decisions. And it's been in place at the EPA ever since. I mean, it's a building block of how the EPA acts and works. Moving on, risk management became an important thing in the 1980s. Okay, so the context for the emergence of this notion of risk management, this notion that a good environmental decision results from consideration of various possible options, okay, and the consideration of the cost and benefits of decisions. The context for that is so the continuation of these kind of controversies around the toxicity of chemicals, these attempts from the EPA to ban them, and a slightly then evolving kind of atmosphere where some industry groups, Republicans, but even in the Carter administration before Reagan was elected, a feeling that what the EPA did had to be sort of moderated. The word at the time was regulatory review, then became regulatory reform, and then regulatory relief. But really the idea that rather than advancing regulation all the time, being sort of intervening more strongly on chemicals and markets and industries, we should sort of moderate these interventions. And so as Reagan was elected, the feeling that the atmosphere was completely changing and that the EPA, in its use of science, would start to be, perhaps, blocked by the administration. And then a reverse kind of dispute in the sense that when the Republicans came into power and came to lead the EPA, there was a different sort of use of science that emerged with some of the political appointees of the time trying to, correct what the scientists in-house were saying about the different risks, intervening in the science, but in a sort of not very subtle way, and in a way that's been too obvious to the public and observers. And then so a controversy again that emerged about how the EPA was sort of trying to advance policy by distorting the science. So all of that, this series of disputes from the end of the 70s to the early 80s, so pushed a number of scientists, again, inside the EPA, outside the EPA, at the National Academies of Science. There's a panel then that played a very important role in coming up with this new, what I called bureaucratic technology, this new way of making a sort of accepted, balanced decision. And it's building on the previous kind of element. You have the quantitative risk assessment part here. What risk management is about is this sort of sphere. And at that moment in 1983, 1984, what the EPA started doing is saying that there should be a quantitative risk assessment kind of process on the one hand and a separate risk management process on the other hand. And environmental decisions, regulatory decisions, is what crystallizes when those two sort of intersect, right? And risk management included regulatory analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and again, that was an innovation at the time. That became also a really important element of the identity of the EPA and how it acts and how it works. And here, Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first administrator and someone who was reappointed in 1983 by Ronald Reagan, so made this famous speech at Princeton in June '83, really explaining what the EPA is, really, in that sort of short kind of couple of sentences, saying, so what EPA does is not sort of regulate air or regulate water or take care of climate change or acid rains or what have you. It sort of simplified the whole thing, saying the EPA is an agency that assesses risks on the one hand and manages risks on the other. So something that became, to this day, that has become an important element of the identity of the EPA and remains one. I'll give you a third example and try to then, I guess, come to my conclusion. Risk ranking, or what's been called also comparative risk assessment, is a third important technique for how to make more or less well-accepted decisions by the EPA. So the context for this is a different context, a different kind of dispute about what the EPA does and how well it does and what it should do. One that concerns its priorities and its ability to sort of pick the right or wrong problems. And what you have let's say in the second half of the 1980s, you have a moment when the EPA was under attack, or from some of the offices of the EPA were under attack for their choices to focus on LR, the pesticide, in LR residues on apples, for instance, or to develop a really strong program on radon and the risks of radon, which sort of proved to some misplaced. Basically, the controversy here is about the inconsistency of the EPA. That's a word that sort of came back really, really often in the press or in the mouths of the EPA opponents and so on. The EPA is an agency that doesn't pick the right risk to regulate, that doesn't do this consistently, or even that do this with some contradicting measures across its different offices that sometimes look at the same thing, the same chemical, the same environmental issue, and don't say actually the same thing about the same issue, right? So that problem of inconsistency, which generated a lot of, let's say, dispute around what the agency was saying, and sort of and harmed its capacity to put some strong environmental standards across, sort of crystallized again under another kind of bureaucratic form of risk ranking. And this time, it's a different kind of science that was used. It's not the science that was developed by sort of toxicologists for quantitative risk assessment. It was not the science of policy analysts, let's say, but it was the contribution here. The key contribution was from economists in-house who developed this notion of risk ranking, translating it to a whole complex discipline inside the EPA of collecting information about the priorities of the different offices, measuring those priorities on scales of risks, costs, benefits, sort of to construct a sort of a radar of all of the issues that the EPA could take on. And so risk ranking, comparative risk analysis has been, well, has sort of risen and fallen as an important, as an expertise in the agency. It was really strong in the early 1990s. It sort of declined afterwards. But for a moment, it really became an important part of what risk decision making is about, and something that's been occasionally useful for the agency to address some of these environmental issues and the contestation around environmental issues. There are many more of these techniques that have been developed over time at the EPA, again, through what I call design networks, network of scientists of different sorts, people who come from the life sciences or policy sciences, who sort of coalesced to develop solutions, basically, for the EPA bureaucracy, for how to advance decisions and standards. So here are some of the things that I write about in the book. You'll find different chapters about each of these things. I obviously don't have the time to go through all of them, but just to mention them. So what do we learn from all this? What kind of conclusion can we draw from this history? And in what way does that help us understanding what's going on now? I guess there are 3 points. The first thing is that we should consider that from the start, science is a battleground, is a field, again, in which various kind of actors try to forge what's the legitimate knowledge to make our environmental policy and make environmental standards. And that sort of these conflicts reflect in what the EPA does and what it looks like. And again, people who try to support the EPA inside or outside, who try to help it develop environmental policy and standards, so will work through the science and a certain kind of science, and a science of decision making to reach those goals. So the second point, and I've alluded to that in my introduction. Everyone sort of tries to shape this science. All actors interested who have a stake in environmental policy try to do so, and including the actors who aim to minimize environmental standards. And they've done that at many occasions during the EPA history. And again, it's a pity I don't have the time to go through that, but the current situation really resonates with what has happened in the early 1980s, when Reagan got elected, when an EPA administrator was appointed that really sort of, tried to, again, intervene quite strongly in the science. And so the EPA is not suddenly under siege. It doesn't discover this kind of state of, this atmosphere of contestation of its action and of its knowledge. One thing that, again, emerges from this history is that those actors who try to minimize environmental intervention, who are against sort of strong federal environmental policies and interventions, I think have gone through a sort of learning process for how to do that, how to work on the science to sort of slow down the EPA, slow decision-making down, and minimize environmental intervention. Certainly since the 1990s, we can observe that scientists in the industry, a number of research centers who were been created mid-90s. I talk about in the book the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis. And the whole Republican side, people who have tried for years and probably from the very beginning of the EPA to sort of delegitimize it, or again, to use a more moderate language, to sort of minimize environmental intervention, have grown more credible and more equipped on the science, and have grown more influential on how the EPA works internally, how it makes decisions, what kind of data, what kind of models it uses to assess the risks, and so on. And what we're seeing today is the continuation of this. So this is not a final book cover, but it's a cover. And so the book is soon coming out, and it's a long book. It's 452 pages, but that means you get all the details in it. So if you're interested, you're obviously, welcome to have a look. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, David. Incredibly interesting. And since I anticipate this is going to trigger some good conversation, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, which is, you have not, you've kind of put science in a black box as a thing. Do you want to say anything about what the science is? Because I think if you walk around this town, which 97% of voters voted for Hillary Clinton in this town, you will see on many lawns signs with a list of various virtues. You know, we love our neighbors, water is important, sustainability. And one of the things you'll see on many of these signs is science is real. Mm-hmm. And so there is some very broad set of beliefs and assertion around science as this particular, truth-generating, fact-generating thing. So that clearly is part of belief, right, is part of the disputes that you're categorizing. So can you spend a minute, are you willing to, opening up the black box of what you called science? Science is real. How does that doesn't seem that helpful in understanding what's going on. So how do you look at science? Mm-hmm.
So science is real is it's a puzzling kind of phrase. Science, in the way I'm using it, and the kind of science I'm referring to, is something that is fundamentally political, and I mean that in a very positive way, meaning that the science embarks necessarily when you're actually looking at complex and uncertain environmental issues. By necessity, it embarks a number of choices, assumptions, potentially values. And clearly, I think the scientists inside the EPA, or even outside the EPA, with an interest in environmental issues, do know this and do work with the political substance of their science, actually admitting that, and it's at the center of these quantitative risk assessment things that I briefly described, actually admitting that when you assess a risk, when you calculate a risk, even when you do these things as apparently technical and objective as calculating a probability, you do make choices that are implicitly political in the sense of how far you want to protect the environment, how far you want to protect different kinds of populations, and how strongly you want to intervene on industries, and how severe you want your standard to be at the end of the day. And so when I say science, I mean a very sort of political science that is forged by disputes between scientists who don't necessarily make the same assumption about the extent of the risk and the extent to which we should intervene to protect people from the risk. And so Again, these are debates that don't necessarily surface a lot. They're sort of contained inside the agency. They are hidden sort of in the graphs I've showed you, which look like very, obviously, again, very logical, very generic. Oh yeah, it seems completely logical to do things this way. But when you actually implement those decision-making disciplines and try to bring the science in support of this decision, you make all of these choices. And again, I think it's scientists involved and regulators involved, bureaucrats involved know this for a fact, I think.
So can I just get a sense of who is at the moment aching to have a? Okay, so let's try to keep questions short, and if you have comments, keep them short as well. And yes, we'll ask David to keep answers short too. So we'll just start at the front and move our way back. So,
so David, thanks for.
Thanks for your presentation. Could you maybe go back to that one slide where you had risk assessment at the bottom, and then you had policy considerations on the. Yep, this one. Now, so what the question is, and I think it reflects what you just said when you said values. You said values is part of the science and part of the consideration that scientists need to keep in mind when you think about decision making, because our value systems are part of what constitutes national priorities. National priorities, they might be spelled out in a list, but the way that you rank the national priorities speaks to the values of your constituency. So wouldn't you say that this entire process is science? Because if you think about something like Carl Sagan said once, he said science Carl Sagan said something to the effect, science is a way of thinking. It's a way of considering. My interpretation of that is it's a way of considering how you weigh the many decision criteria, like in multi-criteria decision making, the science of decision making. There are mathematical ways to consider values, data and data from models, and to consider that as a whole. So my question to you again is: isn't this actually a process of science? It's a way of thinking through the various criteria that are impinging your decision? And but you pointed out a very important thing in talking about values. So isn't it an expansion? Science is not just risk assessment. Science is that.
Exactly. No, I think you got me. It's what I was trying to say here with comparative risk analysis and this sort of quasi-scientific way of establishing priorities. You have a translation of what's a sort of a debate out there in society with people with different values and agenda, saying, well, no, climate change is obviously much more important than the risk of whatever chemical, and the EPA should tackle that first. And comparative risk analysis is sort of the science of putting those disagreements and these value confrontations into a sort of well-channeled and neat sort of form, with one being on top of the other on a sort of agreed upon scale of importance. And obviously, again, it's very political because what's important and the criteria you choose are obviously very impactful on what will be retained as a priority. So, but it's a way of translating these value debates and these conflicts out there in society into a list of things ordered by the levels of risks, costs, and benefits of attacking them. Okay.
Philip.
Yes, I'm wondering if.
Sorry, self-identify.
Oh, Philip Frankenfeld. I'm wondering if within the book you mentioned something that's exogenous to the EPA with respect to decision making and some of the methodologies that they use at different times and in putatively different regimes of cost-benefit analysis and things like that. I'm talking here specifically of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the OMB.
Yeah.
Do you consider that within the book and talk about how, first of all, it can unilaterally override some of the final decisions that are made? And then second of all, how it sets a level of prioritization of which costs of the extent to which they look at costs versus benefits, and the methodology of cost-benefit analysis and risk ranking. OIRA does that kind of a thing and probably has some influence on the EPA at different points with different OIRA directors.
Yeah. So, yeah, I say that with a little more sort of precision and subtlety, I guess, in the book than already here. But these processes whereby ways of making decisions are developed cut across the agency and involve people outside the agency and people inside the agency and at certain places in the agency, certain offices. And so to understand what's being used and retained as a way of decision making, a criteria, you need to sort of recompose the whole network that was influential at any point in time in the development of these methods. And again, so I tell the story of how, the OMB in the early 1990s or the OIRA around 2005, 2006, 2007 sort of has become part of this sort of network of people who try to design how the EPA works and has become sort of more influential in these moments, or has sort of advanced certain propositions for what a standard risk assessment should be, what are the criteria of cost and benefits, above which there should be intervention and below which there should be no intervention. So there's a politics to that also, with different moments in time when you see people with different political affiliations of getting in the fight and out the fight and out of the fight, and how this reflects into what's being applied at the EPA. In fact. So again, I can only refer back to the book. I didn't have more time to give some of the details, but OMB and OIRA has been a very important player, at different moments. Not all the time, though. But.
Were there any third row? Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Angie Boyce, a AAAS fellow, and this was a great talk. Thank you. I was wondering, so one of the things I was thinking about in your talk was how has the human been constructed over time, and has that changed? Particularly the challenge of sort of variable response to risk. Like, I'm thinking of the ALAR episode and how what spurred the agency to action, a lot of it was, children are consumers of apple juice and pesticide residues in apple juice, we need to take action fast, versus that tension of, well, when we need to make a standard, we have to make a standard that sort of serves everybody at the population level. So I was wondering if you can talk about that tension.
Yeah. It is a tension indeed, and it's a difficulty for the agency. It's part of, in quantitative risk assessment, you have this part that's called exposure assessment. And I think people inside the EPA and outside have always recognized that this part of the process was the most difficult one, because it's the one on which there's the least available data, the one on which sort of scientists do not agree for how to make an exposure assessment, and at the same time, exposure assessment is there, yeah. And at the same time, something that's very useful for the agency to tweak, sort of to play with in terms of parameters of the decision. And again, there are important key moments when people sort of tried to forge the right criteria for exposure assessment, saying, should we continue making decisions based on who is the maximally exposed individual, as I said, or should we take into account the greater sort of variety of exposure situations and what the average exposure is? And again, if you sort of scratch deep in that, you see perennial kind of political disputes about how to find the right parameter and what to institutionalize in the agency. So, yeah, I mean, a key tension, as you say, and a key site of contention inside the agency and outside.
I think we had a cluster in the back row.
Sure. Hi, Brendan Fote. You mentioned at the beginning. Sorry. Yes, Brendan Fote, sorry. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk how sort of anti-regulation forces are trying to intervene in the science that's being used by EPA, intervening on what kinds of models are used and methods and various technical things of that nature that seem to kind of fit in the risk assessment portion of the process. Are they also trying to intervene at the later processes of risk management or so forth, where, I mean, it seems like that's where their concerns really lie, is in the sort of comparison between sort of economic growth and regulation and so forth, rather than really honestly being concerned with the technicalities of unpublished studies and things of this nature. So are they intervening in the science as a way to kind of hide the ball on what they're really concerned with? Is that successful? Is it necessary? Maybe you could just sort of speak on that a little bit.
No, they're clearly working with risk management as well as risk assessment, intervening on the whole process and all of the aspects of making decision or constructing a standard. But when I said, I stressed risk assessment, I stressed the scientific part because I think that's the, I think it's the new aspect. It's what's, I guess, in the past 10, 15 years has been, I guess, the main strategy of those actors. Because doing things through science make it less obvious that you're actually trying to implement a particular political stance, you know, in environmental policy. Because it's not obvious to everyone that pushing, let's say, quantitative uncertainty analysis is something that carries a sort of kind of environmental standard kind of stance. I mean, you would need to know the details and the practice of this to be able to say, oh, yeah, look, here is an instrument for blocking environmental intervention. But indeed, this is what it is. I mean, it was, and that's what people I've interviewed at the EPA, that's the way they told it to me. It was a clear, back in 2005, 2006, pushing uncertainty analysis was a clear Republican agenda implemented inside the agency to try and slow down decisions by saying that there is uncertainty in the decision, so we should wait to have more data, better models, and so on and so forth until we make the decision. And secondly, by saying that we can analyze uncertainty, that we can quantify uncertainty, it's a sort of, saying that there's actually a possibility to calculate and be more precise, and that we should employ those possibilities. We should do it as much as possible. So for about 10, 15 years, this has been strongly pushed by, people with a Republican or sort of sensibility inside the agency, resisted by others inside the agency or outside the agency, but clearly it was a political front. And I think, again, what we are observing today is the continuation of this, clearly. So.
I just ask, when you say clearly it was a political front, surely you don't mean to say that only one side is political.
No,
right?
exactly.
So, I mean, there is a symmetry to this, right? It's just that my guess is, for example, we're in Washington, we're mostly, if not all, Democrats in this room. If there are any Republicans or non-aligns here, it would be interesting to hear from you. But that one can apply a symmetry to this, right? You could have the same conversation, and the them would be us, right?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Alice Ortuzar, and I'm a watershed steward in Montgomery County. And in the mid-1980s, Consumer Reports did an in-depth analysis of how ChemWatt conducted an effective campaign in the 1950s to, in a very short time, 3 or 4 years, convince the majority of Americans to abandon their biodiverse, chemical-free yards for manicured monoculture turf grass dependent on chemicals we were told were safe, which we since found out we're not. In 1996, Jacques Cousteau's last book had an in-depth and scathing analysis of our risk assessment paradigms used to, as some of your examples show, justify toxic products as so-called safe. Is any country doing better than we are?
I mean, what strikes me as a big difference between what's happening here and in Europe, I guess, and in certain European countries, is that things here are much more political and much more partisan and much more reflective of the political debate and the political atmosphere, whereas risk decision making, risk assessment, the sort of risk assessment, risk management, so-called paradigm in Europe would not as easily reflect sort of political stances about environmental intervention, the sort of institutions for environmental policy than here. Here, I mean, if you scratch the surface a little bit, not too much, you immediately find some strong political stances about whether these topics should be objects of federal policy, and therefore behind that some sort of ideological sense about whether something should be taken care of as a sort of national issue or not. And this kind of political substance is much less strong on the European side, where this risk paradigm is well accepted as something through which we can sort of altogether make rational decisions. So I don't know if that's better or or not, but it's certainly a very different.
Probably worth mentioning that this is hardwired into the DNA of our country, of course, because the origins of the Constitution in our system are the debate over how much power should the central government have.
Exactly, yeah. And the very particular circumstances in which the EPA has been sort of created, which sort of has an influence to this day about whether we should have an EPA or not in this country. So.
I think you're sort of, my name's Ann Vroom, and I think that you've kind of hit or heading towards, the EPA was set up, and I sort of am old enough to have been through its entire trajectory. There was controversy about whether this was a federal place to be, federal action or state action. Mm-hmm. And of course, at that time, there were places where there were incidences in states where the states had not taken adequate action, and so that, gave impetus to the idea of it being federal. But even though it's federal now, it was set up as a federal state effort. So the states are supposed to partially fund the EPA offices in their individual states, et cetera. And it's supposed to be a joint effort. Now, that's where the politics gets a little murky, is where the rubber hits the road. And I'll give you two examples. One is West Virginia. West Virginia has fought, I think to this day they still don't fund any state portion of the EPA effort in West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And West Virginia is a solidly Democratic state, or at least was up until just recently. But this was back in the day when they were all Democrat. The other example is brownfields, urban brownfields. The EPA came in, and a lot of these old gas stations were designated as toxically polluted, and there was going to be an enormous cost to barrel up the dirt and the asphalt and take it away and store it. So these gas stations just plots throughout urban areas like Detroit, like Washington, D.C., et cetera, were sitting empty year after year after year. Then in places like Washington, the mayor and the developers, very Democrat city, as you've said, decided, well, we're going to have to kick back on some of this because we want development in those old parking lot areas, and basically kick back the EPA regulations and loosen them so that they could just take the dirt and dump it in West Virginia, I guess. So, you know, it's not, in the federal, of course, it's always a bipartisan playground, back and forth. But when you actually get to the state levels where these things have to be implemented, it becomes much more, like I said, murky, where you can say, oh, the Republicans always do this and the Democrats always do that. You know, oh, the Republicans are always against it. Oh, the Democrats are always for it. That's just not the case. And I wonder to what extent you blend in that nuance to your thinking.
Well, what's interesting is that again, you see the contrast between what you're describing, the sort of, local fights around, environmental measures you're describing, and the sort of things that this sort of evinces, you know, the sense that we can find sort of, we can establish uniform, accepted measures of risk that we can sort of either at a distance from Washington say, in this state we should apply, or that even we should sort of roll out across the territory. So you should see all of these kind of tools and techniques for making decisions as, again, ways of responding to those situations that the EPA has faced. And in fact, risk assessment inside the agency is something that has been pushed in all of the regional branches and offices as a sort of technique for regional EPA, so bureaucrats, to handle these sort of complicated relations with states and all of these sort of stakeholders at local level, to try and say, yes, there is a way to actually sort of bring everyone on board and forge together some sort of accepted measures of the risk and therefore of environmental standards. So I would put things the other way around. In fact, it is a situation that people have thought through and tried to address through that kind of scheme, you know, for making decisions.
Hi there, my name is Quill Robinson. I was struck by the contrast between that first slide with those headlines and what you said after, because I was interested to hear how there's sort of this long-standing tradition of there being a dialectical and multidimensional process of decision-making. It's not just science decision done. You know, there's policy considerations, there's legal considerations, et cetera. And as you also talked about, you know, if you look at the yard signs around DC, it seems like science is sort of this golden calf, and that the current administration is destroying it. And so I guess I'm curious, you know, why is science now conflated with certain policy prescriptions? And why is there this outrage with the current administration if this has always been a multidimensional process where different considerations have been taken into account? And is this perhaps more of political beef with the administration than an actual violation of the science?
Interesting question. To what degree is it more? I'm not sure it's more controversial now than it's been in the past. I guess we tend to forget, and I certainly have forgotten because I probably wasn't born in the 70s. And but there were like very intense moments in the 70s and early 80s where exactly as now there was intense contestation and controversy about how the EPA and how legitimate the EPA was and its leaders and its political appointees and its decision makers to actually play with the science and shape the science or not. There are certain ways of, I guess if there's something about science here, and that goes back to your original question, it's science in the sense that there are rules to make decisions on accepted sort of knowledge, right? And these are the sort of rules I'm talking about. And so there's a contrast between those rules are being developed over time and they sort of gradually sort of take hold in the agency, and they're accepted as the right way of making decisions, the right way of making environmental policy. And there are moments when some people will want to break with those rules and this sort of accepted wisdom. And I guess that's what make things really controversial now, as they were in the early 80s or in the 70s. It's like, yeah, we should, if we want to agree on something and make decisions, sort of make accepted decisions in this political system, we need to follow certain rules. Scientists have used their experience and their sort of particular mindset to develop some of these rules through experience, and we should try and sort of, yeah, stay close to these rules rather than changing the rules of the game all the time. And so, again, when a new administration, yeah, comes in and wants to change these rules, I guess it makes things, yeah, controversial, and we would be, I think, right in this kind of moment now.
I'm John Alec. Seems to me there's another black box here, and that's, excuse me, that's the legal system, the peculiarly U.S. legal system. There's a whole stream of analysis about judge-made law, for example. And judges, of course, are almost as good as scientists at pretending to be, you know, above and beyond politics. But we all know they're not. How does that fit into your understanding of this?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer. That's the first first short answer, I guess.
Makes you a minority in this town.
But I alluded to that at the beginning with this sort of quantitative risk assessment notion, which I think was consciously developed as a way to make decisions that would pass the test of the court, of judges' review of the basis of decisions at the agency, and this, just like the doctrines applied by judges in court about how far they could review those facts and of that agencies invoke and their methods, just like these doctrines has evolved, I guess conversely the way in which the EPA has made quantitative risk assessment has also evolved, so showing that there's an interplay between what the EPA does and what's happening in the legal system or in courts. So it's partly a black box in what I describe, because I'm not a lawyer, but I address it. I address this dimension still.
I think we should wrap up. If I see two repeat offenders, if you want to make it, if you each want to make it very quick in succession, and then David, you can have a final comment, and then we'll wrap up.
I've walked out of presentations on studies such as education that were so quantitative. I walked out wondering what happened to the people. Can you compare quantitative versus qualitative studies in the context of health and well-being?
So the quick question has to do with documenting decisions and your thoughts about, like the National Environmental Policy at NEPA requires, before a state government were to, clean up a brownfield site, to issue something called a record of decision, an ROD. Does INRA, I don't know how INRA works really on adjudicating cost-benefit analysis for regulations, but is INRA required to document its decision about regulations based on risk assessments, or within an agency, are agencies required to document the decisions exactly why and link it to data and link it to national priorities and link it to cost-benefit analysis? What is the level of documentation? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's very detailed. Yeah, INRA has required this. There are, again, different moments of that. Certain times INRA is very, very stringent in terms of what documentation it requires from the agency and how close it follows the process and how long it will sort of retain and remake the calculations sort of itself before letting the agency decide. But clearly, transparency is a key driver here in all this story. and the development of risk decision making in general. It's about developing rules through which the agency can demonstrate how it makes its decisions and respond sort of a priori to requirements of transparency that have been pushed through INRA and through the law and stuff. And where are the people? I guess it's a question we should leave open, but it's this whole history is about also the expansion of quantification in government, right? In the fact that through some sort of quantitative measurement of risks, costs, and benefits, we can actually pacify a little bit the environmental kind of environmental politics and come to shared decisions. But the drawback to this is indeed how do you then address through uniform measures the particular situation of a state, of a community, of one chemical rather than another, to vulnerable populations against sort of the average situation. So, and again, these are tensions that the agency grapples with all the time. So there's not, open question, open debate, and something that I guess is with the agency for a long time.
So as I was listening to David's incredibly acute, thoughtful, and knowledgeable insights into what's going on in this country, it made me realize that in the mid 19th century, a Frenchman came to the U.S. and wrote a book that is maybe as good an assessment of what it is to be American as has ever been done. Of course, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So you are our de Tocqueville of environmental regulation and science. I think sometimes it does take someone from the outside to really look in and give us a fresh view of who we are and what we're doing. So we're grateful for that, David. Thank you all.
Thanks for your kind
Please
words.
do hang around, finish the coffee and food, talk to each other, talk to David, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Hi.
For your presentation. Andrew Dufresne.
Thank you.
I'm
Nice to
a
meet you.
science educator, and actually, one of the things that I really piqued my interest about coming to hear your talk is that I worked with